Good morning and welcome to the River's Edge West Changing Rivers 19th Annual Conference. My name is Chris Sturm and I'm the Watershed Program Director for the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And I'm going to be talking to you today about mitigating impacts of climate change at watershed scales. And from my point of view, when I'm talking about impacts from climate change, I'm primarily thinking about fires and floods. And a little bit of drought as well. Those are the three things that I primarily deal with that are the result of climate change. So the CWCB, just a little bit about us. Our mission is to conserve, develop, protect, and manage Colorado's water for present and future generations. We are an agency within the State Department of Natural Resources. And when I talk about water supplies, relative to our mission, talking about different uses of water, and we can see those in these icons on the slide, and they include environment, agriculture, municipal, industrial, and recreational uses of water. So let's start with a little bit of science. We're gonna have a discussion that's going to include a little bit of science. We're going to get into just a tiny bit of policy, and then my favorite part, a little bit of implementation. We all know what a watershed is. There's different definitions. I think John Wesley Powell's is very eloquent in that it includes a social element. It includes the human piece of it, which is incredibly important as we try to mitigate impacts to watersheds, because within our watersheds in Colorado, we cross a lot of political boundaries. And so we have to remind ourselves to work across those boundaries at a watershed scale. So watershed and forest health. Watershed health is something discussed in Colorado's first ever water plan that was released in 2015. And we will be doing an update of that over the next coming years, working on it now. And so this definition is evolving, and I think it's important for us to understand that we define it as a measure of ecosystem structure and function. And forest health is a popular topic that's come up as well. From my point of view, I consider forest health just the same thing as watershed health, but there's a different spatial difference there, and that forests can be part of a watershed, but watersheds can be bigger than just the forested part. But when we're talking about mitigating impacts, and those could include fire and then post-fire flooding, we see impacts to ecosystem structure, which is often the trees themselves or plants. And then we have impacts to ecosystem functions, which a big one for water managers is the hydrologic cycle, and more specifically, the flow regime and sediment regimes. So let's talk about resilience as it relates to watershed and forest health. Resilience is one of those R words. I swear I've been dealing with R words my entire career that are difficult to define. It started off with restoration, and now it's resilience. So the Colorado Resiliency Office, their definition is the ability of communities to rebound, positively adapt to, or thrive amidst changing conditions or challenges, including human-caused and natural disasters, and to maintain quality of life, healthy growth, durable systems, economic vitality, and conservation of resources for present and future generations. That is a lot. When I think about resilience, I think about ecological resilience. And when I Googled it, the hauling definition that I'm familiar with comes up straight away. And it's the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb repeated disturbances or shocks and adapt to change without fundamentally switching to an alternative stable state. So here we're getting at crossing threshold boundaries or not crossing them. And in our approach to mitigating impacts, we're certainly trying to get back to stable states after disturbances. To get further into some of the work that the Colorado Resiliency Office has done in their latest framework, which is scheduled to be released anytime now if it hasn't come out already, there's a lot of discussion about resiliency across many different sectors. Natural resources is just one of those. But in the natural resources sector, There is a goal to integrate stream, watershed, and forest management planning efforts. And you can see the rest of the definition up there. But this is something that's really resonated with me from a policy point of view, because we do a lot of watershed planning at the board. And we do forest pre-fire mitigation strategies, forest health planning, but haven't seen these combined a lot. And that's where we're moving forward in trying to combine this planning and bring it together. So back to resilience and steady states. I have an example up here that's a sediment regime, because that's what I'm most familiar with. And when we think about steady state, we should remember that that's not static. It's still a dynamic state. And we can see this through patterns of erosion and deposition in stream systems. But then there could be a disturbance or a perturbation and a response. And then ideally we get back to the original steady state condition. So for me, resilience is the amount of time from a disturbance back to the original steady state. And so the healthier a watershed or the healthier a forest, the quicker that we could return back to, say, a flow regime that we're familiar with after a fire. That's one example. And so below I've got a hydrograph from snowmelt driven system. I think a lot of us are familiar with this. But just keeping with a little bit of science, and definitions are important. Flow regime is made up of different things, and magnitude being the discharge of flow. I think everyone's familiar with that. Frequency, how often a flow is experienced at a given discharge. Duration, how long that flow lasts. Timing, seasonal changes, and then rate of change changes from one discharge to another. So these are all elements of the flow regime that our environment and our society has adapted to. And so when we experience disturbances, say a flood after fire, we see big changes in this flow regime. We may see larger magnitude flow events, and the timing of those can peak outside of when we normally see our snowmelt peak, for example, and the rate of change can be pretty extreme too. And all of this can result into changes in the stream network that have impacts on our water supply. And of course, when we're talking water supply, we think of all those 5 different uses that I brought up. So there's 2 different studies that Department of Natural Resources has completed in the recent past, unrelated to each other. One of them was for the CWCB, that's on the right side of the screen here, and the other was for the Department of Water Resources. Both of these studies suggested a potential increase in short duration rainfall intensity of 5 to 15% in the state of Colorado. And that basically is just saying that as the atmosphere heats up with climate change, there's potential for the atmosphere to hold more moisture because it's warmer, which can result in larger storm events. Now, a 5 to 15% increase in rainfall translates to a larger increase in flood flows. Okay, keeping with a little bit more science, but bringing in our forest health elements into traditional watershed planning, the Colorado State Forest Service has recently completed the 2020 Forest Action Plan, and they serve up a lot of the data in the plan on the Colorado Forest Atlas. You can see a link to that at the bottom of the slide. I got an account to this recently because there's a lot of wonderful data here, and as we move forward with our watershed planning, at minimum, this data should be brought in with other data that we're looking at. On this slide right here is a watershed protection layer where we have priority areas where opportunities to exist to improve or maintain water quality and quantity. I drilled into this further and found a wildfire risk layer, which is a composite of different variables, including burn probability and values at risk. And those values at risk are societal and water supply are among those. There's other elements in there as well. So this type of data overlaid with other data that we have for watershed planning can be really helpful in directing us towards areas where we'd like to have implementation. Here I have the 2021 existing stream and integrated water management planning areas. So this is a type of watershed planning that CWCB programs support. It consists of capacity stakeholder building, assessment work, and then prioritization and implementation. Now the assessments typically are in the realm of geomorphological assessments, biological, and of course hydrological. Those are the three thou shouts in doing these types of planning if we're tapping into CWCB funding. And I bring this up because if you look at the different polygons and lines, we've got both lines and polygons represented here, we could see a lot of planning areas that would overlap with areas where we're concerned about forest health. And as we're doing those assessments, we can leverage a lot of work by paying attention to objectives in both realms. So the CWCB has recently brought on some experts to help us with our post-fire response. This is a reality. 2020 was one of the worst fire seasons in history in the state. And there is a need to come up with a standardized approach on how we're going to respond to fires. And here I have an example from the East Troublesome Fire, where we used hydrologic modeling and overlaid that with what we call values at risk. Those could be structures, houses, businesses, etc., and other infrastructure, culverts, bridges, roads, diversions, other reservoirs. And then we developed these heat maps to show us locations of concern based on magnitude of increase in runoff and the burn affected watershed. I use this as an example because it's really tough to get all this together after fire when you're trying to respond quickly, make very thoughtful decisions about values that need to be protected. And a lot of this work can be done in pre-fire scenarios when we're looking at forest health planning. A lot of the data can be brought in then. We can even run different hydrologic and hydraulic modeling with different burn severity assumptions to start giving us an idea of areas that are at risk. And then we can start developing projects to mitigate that risk. So I love this Healthy Meadows example. I keep checking my watch here to make sure I'm on time. And what we see here on the left is an example of a healthy meadow below a forested watershed, an example of an unhealthy meadow on the other side. And part of what we could do in pre-planning to mitigate for future disturbances is identify these areas. Do we have healthy meadows out there? Do they have the ability to attenuate debris in, say, a post-fire flood scenario? Or they look something like that on the right where they're already unhealthy and what should be a depositional area is contributing a lot of sediment downstream already. And in the event of a flood could likely contribute more. So it has downstream impacts to water supply. It has local impacts to water supply as well, and that this is not a healthy ecosystem. And if this is an agricultural parcel, it makes it very difficult to tap into the water, whether direct diversion or through wells. So identifying these areas before disaster can help us prioritize areas for protection or restoration. And some new tools that the CWCB has in this realm, one being our Fluvial Hazard Zone tool. The FHZ is an area a stream has occupied in recent history or may occupy or influence as it stores and transports water, sediment, and debris. And the Fluvial Hazard Zone, in my opinion, can show us areas of risk and opportunity at the same time. And opportunities for community protection and enhancement of environmental and recreational attributes increase tremendously when we map and recognize this fluvial hazard zone. So if we're looking at a scenario of protecting healthy meadows and knowing that they're going to function well to mitigate impacts from disturbances, then FHZ could be used to provide protection at a local level, maybe through a local ordinance that excludes development. So we have to constantly be thinking about protecting what's functioning well, or if we're doing restoration, then what are our strategies to subsequently protect it? This is a good time for me to bring up that we do have grant programs to support everything I've been talking about. We are fortunate in that we are able to put our money where our mouths are, and we have several different grant programs for watershed protection. That includes the Colorado Watershed Restoration Program, Colorado Water Plan grants for environment and recreation, the Healthy Rivers Fund, and the Fish and Wildlife Resources Fund. And if you want to learn more about those, please go to our website and look for the Grants and Loans tab, or you can contact me directly. So I'm just about done. I wish I had more time to talk about implementation because that's my favorite part. But really, we will get into all aspects of that, including the planning phase, how to prioritize what we implement. But then when we get into actual implementation, we've been fortunate enough to learn a lot over the last decade because we've been involved in some pretty big flood recovery efforts. And through that, we've developed a lot of different resources. And one example I have here are just some cut sheets for construction that are meant to be used almost like recipes in the field, in that they can be adapted. These are living documents, but it's a very good start. The example I have here is for soil lifts. We get into the materials that might be needed, the equipment needs, common problems that you'll see out in the field, and then taking you through the process of foundation and forming, and brush layering and backfilling. So all the different elements of construction are represented here. I will just leave you here with some examples of the types of disturbances that I have been seeing, and I really appreciate your time and look forward to any questions that you might have.